Did you know that during the Second World War, the American government manufactured and shipped more records than it did munitions by weight? Millions of shellac discs spinning at 78 RPM were sent across oceans. They were considered just as essential as bullets and bandages. How could a simple song, a 3 minute escape, hold so much power? What was it about a melody that could strengthen a soldier's resolve or give a factory worker the energy for one more shift? If music wasn't just background noise during the global conflict of the 1940s, it was a weapon. It was a comfort. It was the invisible thread that connected a soldier in a foxhole to his sweetheart back home. It was the rhythm of defiance and the promise of a future where people could dance again. Why did governments pour resources into broadcasting big bands when steel was so precious? How did the lyrics of a pop song become a form of national prayer? This was the soundtrack to a world on fire, and every note mattered. Number 19. Why did a simple melody matter so much? It seems strange to think about. In a time of immense struggle and complex global strategy, the simplest things often had the biggest impact. And nothing was simpler than a catchy tune. The songs that really stuck weren't always the grand, patriotic anthems. They were the ones you could hum without thinking, the ones with a melody so straightforward it felt like you'd always known it. Think about "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree with Anyone Else But Me." The Andrews sisters recorded their famous version in 1942. The song is not about fighting, it's not about grand sacrifice. It's a light, almost silly plea for a partner to stay faithful. But its bouncy rhythm and easy to remember chorus made it an instant hit. Soldiers sang it, factory workers hummed it. It was a little piece of normal life, a reminder of dances and dates, injected into a very abnormal world. This simplicity was its strength. A soldier didn't need to be a great singer to join in. A family huddled around a radio could pick up the tune instantly. This phenomenon is something modern science has explored. Dr. James Caleris of the University of Cincinnati has studied what makes a song an earworm. He found that simple, repetitive melodic contours are key. The brain latches onto them easily. In the 1940s, songwriters like Frank Loesser were masters of this. His 1942 song, Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition, was based on a story about a chaplain at Pearl Harbor. The chorus is incredibly simple and powerful. It's a chant, it repeats, you hear it once, and you can shout it back. It gave people a feeling of active participation, even if they were just singing along. The simplicity also made the music incredibly portable. You didn't need a full orchestra. A group of soldiers could sing it a cappella, a single person could whistle it while they worked. This is what made music a constant companion. Unlike a movie or, a formal concert, a simple song could be everywhere all the time. It filled the silence and pushed back against the anxiety. The War Production Board, the U.S. government agency that supervised war production, understood this. In a 1943 report, they noted that music has been found to be a great morale builder. This wasn't about high art. It was about functional, effective tools. A simple song was a tool for focus, a tool for unity, and a tool for remembering what normal felt like. But what if the very simplicity of these songs was a double-edged sword, making the complex realities of the conflict seem almost trivial? Is it possible that the catchiest, most effective songs were actually the least honest about the situation? And how many of these seemingly spontaneous hits were the result of careful, deliberate crafting by government propaganda offices, designed to be as infectious and simple as possible? Number 18, How Could a Song Voice? A Woman's New World. The world changed for women between 1939 and 1945. Millions left their homes to work in factories, on farms, and in administrative roles. They were building planes, assembling munitions, and keeping the country running. This was a massive social shift, and music didn't just ignore it. It gave this new reality a voice. One of the most iconic songs of this era was Rosie the Riveter. It wasn't the famous poster that came first, it was the 1942 song written by Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb. The lyrics describe Rosie as someone who was making history, working for victory. She was not a dainty figure waiting at home. She was strong, capable, and essential to the war effort. The song had an upbeat, confident tempo. It was a celebration. For the millions of real-life Rosies, this song was an acknowledgement. It told them their work mattered. It made their dirty, difficult jobs feel glamorous and patriotic. Another key song was The Jitterbug. Though it was cut from the film The Wizard of Oz, its spirit was everywhere in the dance halls. Women, now often with their own paychecks for the first time, went out dancing. They learned the jitterbug and the Lindy Hop. These dances were energetic, athletic, and liberating. Artists like Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman provided the soundtrack. This wasn't just about fun, it was a form of social expression. In her book, Swing Shift All Girl Bands of the 1940s, Sherry Tucker documents how all-female orchestras, like the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, became incredibly popular. They proved that women could not only build bombers, but could also play a mean trumpet solo. They challenged old ideas about what women could and should do. The songs weren't always about strength in the factory, they also dealt with a new emotional landscape. I'll Be Seeing You, sung by Vera Lynn in Britain and Bing Crosby in America, became an anthem for separated lovers. The lyrics speak of seeing the loved one in all the old familiar places. This resonated deeply with women whose partners, brothers, and sons were overseas. It captured a specific kind of hope and longing that was central to their experience. The music gave them a way to articulate a feeling that was often too big for words. It validated their patience and their quiet, constant worry. It was a shared experience sung in unison across the country. But did these songs truly represent the complex reality of women's lives, or did they create a simplified, romanticized version of the female worker? How many women felt alienated by the cheerful Rosie the Riveter image, when their own experiences were filled with exhaustion, low pay, and discrimination? And when the men returned, did the music that had celebrated female independence suddenly shift its tone, pushing women back toward the domestic roles they had only just left? Number 17, was music a secret weapon for the resistance? When we think of the music of the war, we often think of the big bands and the patriotic songs of the Allied nations. But in the occupied territories of Europe, music played a very different role. It became a tool of quiet defiance. It was a way to communicate, to maintain cultural identity, and to resist the oppressive regimes. In France, singing La Marseillaise was strictly forbidden by the occupying forces. To sing, it was an act of rebellion that could get you arrested or worse, so people found other ways. The 1943 song Alamity Friendship by Lucien Delisle seemed innocent enough, but its lyrics about unwavering loyalty in dark times were understood by the French people as a message of solidarity against the occupiers. The song was a coded message of hope. Similarly, jazz music, which the regime in Berlin labeled as degenerate, became a symbol of freedom. Secret jazz clubs, known as Zézou circles, sprang up in Paris. Playing and listening to jazz was a small but significant act of cultural rebellion. It was a way of saying, "You do not control our souls." In Poland, the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 had its own soundtrack. Gay songs were written and performed in the midst of the fighting. Palasek Mishla. Mishle's Palace was one of the most famous. It was a jaunty, almost cheerful tune that described a successful skirmish. The contrast between the upbeat music and the brutal reality of the uprising is jarring. But for the fighters, it was a way to build courage and camaraderie. It turned a desperate struggle into a legendary one, even as it was happening. These songs were documented in the book Songs of the Warsaw Uprising by the Polish Academy of Sciences, showing their importance as historical artifacts. Even classical music was used. In Norway, performances of Edvard Grieg's music became nationalist rallies. Grieg was a symbol of Norwegian identity, and playing his work was a way to assert that identity in the face of occupation. The same happened in Finland with the music of Jean Sibelius. A performance of his Symphony Finlandia was not just a concert, it was a political statement. These acts of musical resistance were incredibly risky. The penalty for being caught was severe, but people did it anyway. Music was a lifeline to their own culture, a reminder of who they were before the occupation. It was a promise that they would one day be free again. But how effective was this musical resistance really? Did a defiant song ever actually stop a tank or save a life? Or was it primarily a comfort for those who were already doomed? We know which songs survived, but how many songs of resistance were written and then lost forever, their creators silenced before their music could spread? And could the occupying forces themselves have used this music, allowing its performance to act as a safety valve to let people blow off steam, making them ultimately easier to control? Number 16, did marching songs actually help win battles? The connection between music and the military is ancient. Drums, bugles, and marching tunes have been used for centuries to coordinate troop movements and build morale. World War II was no different, but the scale and the psychology of it were new. The simple act of putting a rhythm to a soldier's step was a surprisingly powerful tool. Marching songs provided a steady, predictable rhythm. This was crucial for moving large groups of soldiers in an orderly fashion. But the effect was more than just logistical. The shared rhythm created a sense of unity. When hundreds of men are singing the same song and marching in the same rhythm, individuality fades. The group becomes a single, cohesive unit. This is a psychological principle known as muscular bonding, a term coined by historian William H. McNeill in his book Keeping Together in Time. He argued that moving together in time creates a powerful sense of an in-group. The songs themselves were often simple and repetitive, making them easy to learn and sing even when exhausted. The U.S. Army had official songbooks, but soldiers often made up their own lyrics to popular tunes. They created parodies that were filled with dark humor about their food, their officers, and their miserable conditions. A famous example is the set of lyrics to the tune of The Battle Hymn of the Republic, which became Gory, Gory, What a Hell of a Way to Die. Singing about the worst aspects of their situation was a way to control their fear. It was a way to laugh in the face of death. The U.S. military actively studied this. The Army Special Services Division commissioned studies on the psychological effects of music. They found that the right tempo could reduce the perception of fatigue on long marches. A song with a strong beat, around 120 beats per minute, matched a brisk walking pace and could make the effort feel less strenuous. This wasn't just folklore, it was applied science. They also found that community singing before a battle could reduce anxiety and increase feelings of aggression and confidence. It was a way to get hyped up and build what they called fighting spirit. So, a simple marching song wasn't just about keeping time. Tool, it built unity, provided an outlet for fear and frustration, and could even physically sustain soldiers. It turned a collection of individuals into a single, moving force. But what is the line between building unit cohesion and erasing individuality to a dangerous degree? How many soldiers use these songs to suppress genuine, valid fears that should have been addressed? And if a song could make a soldier feel less tired or more brave, could it also make them less likely to question orders or to think critically in a life or death situation? Number 15, how did a record player become a lifeline? For a soldier far from home, silence could be an enemy. The silence between battles, the long nights on watch, the endless weeks on a transport ship. That's where technology stepped in, specifically the phonograph and the V-disc. V-discs, or victory discs, were a special series of records produced by the U.S. government from 1943 to 1949. And they were made for one purpose, only to be shipped to military personnel overseas. This was a massive undertaking. The American Federation of Musicians was in the middle of a recording ban at the time, protesting unpaid royalties from radio play. But they made a special exception for the V-disc program. They agreed to record music for the troops for free. This meant that some of the biggest stars in America, Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, the Andrews Sisters, Duke Ellington, recorded sessions specifically for these discs. The program was overseen by the military's Special Services Division. They produced over 8 million records. These weren't just random songs. The V-discs were like a curated radio show from home. A typical disc might have a big band number on one side and a sweet ballad on the other. Sometimes, the artist would record special spoken introductions directly to the soldiers. This is Glenn Miller speaking for the Army Air Force Orchestra, and we hope you enjoy this next one. Hearing a famous voice speaking directly to them was incredibly powerful. It was a personal connection, a message that they were not forgotten. The records were made of a new, more durable material called vinylite, instead of the standard brittle shellac. This meant they were less likely to break during shipping to rough, remote locations. Portable, hand-cranked record players were also sent out. A group of soldiers in a dugout in the Pacific or a barracks in England could gather around a small player and listen to the sounds of home. It was a temporary escape. For a few minutes, they weren't in a war zone. They were back at a dance hall, in a movie theater, or listening to the radio in the living room. In his book, The V-Discs: A History and Discography, Richard S. Sears details the sheer variety of music produced, from jazz and classical to country and comedy. The program aimed to provide something for everyone. The V-Disc program was a recognition that morale was not a luxury, critical component of a fighting force. A record player was not a toy, it was a piece of essential equipment, a tool for psychological survival. But what music was left out of the V-Disc program? Did the selection reflect a sanitized, idealized version of America, ignoring the more complex or controversial music of the time? How many soldiers in remote outposts never received these records, and what did they use to fill the silence instead? And what happened to the millions of V-Discs after the conflict ended, and why are they so rare today? Number 14, was this the first global jukebox? The Second World War was a global conflict, and for the first time, music traveled with the soldiers on a global scale. Radio was the engine of this phenomenon. Through powerful shortwave transmitters, the music of one nation could be heard across continents and oceans, reaching soldiers, civilians, and even the enemy. The BBC's Forces program was a prime example. Launched in 1940, it was designed specifically for British troops serving abroad. But its reach was far wider. It became a source of news and entertainment for people all across occupied Europe. Listening to the BBC was an act of defiance, a secret connection to the outside world. The program famously featured shows like Sincerely Yours, Vera Lynn. Lynn became known as the Forces sweetheart. Her songs like We'll Meet Again and There'll Be Bluebirds Over the White Cliffs of Dover were filled with a sense of gentle, steadfast hope. They weren't aggressive or jingoistic. They were about endurance and the promise of a peaceful future. This tone resonated deeply with soldiers and civilians who were weary of the conflict. In the United States, the Armed Forces Radio Service AFARS was created in 1942. It eventually broadcast to millions of troops around the world. The AFARS produced its own shows like Command Performance, where soldiers could write in and request their favorite stars to perform. A soldier stationed in North Africa could hear a personalized message from Bob Hope or a song from Judy Garland. This created an incredible sense of connection. It made the vast distances feel smaller. The biggest star of the AFARS was arguably Major Glenn Miller. He gave up a lucrative civilian career to lead the Army Air Force Band. His broadcasts from England were hugely popular. Miller's music was the sound of modern, upbeat America. It was sophisticated, swinging, and optimistic. His disappearance on a flight over the English Channel in 1944 cemented his legendary status. This global jukebox wasn't just one way. The American GIs brought their love for swing, jazz, and blues with them wherever they went. This had a huge cultural impact, especially in Britain and France. The energetic, danceable rhythms of American music were a breath of fresh air. This musical cross-pollination laid the groundwork for the post-war music scene. The sounds that traveled on the airwaves and in the record collections of soldiers changed the musical tastes of the world. But did this flood of American and British music amount to a form of cultural imperialism, drowning out local music and traditions in the places where Allied troops were stationed? How did enemy radio stations like Germany's Lord Haw Haw use the same popular music but twist the lyrics or the context to create demoralizing propaganda? And what were the unintended consequences of beaming the sounds of a free and prosperous America into impoverished and war-torn regions? Number 13, how do you sell a war bond with a song? Wars are incredibly expensive. Governments needed to raise huge amounts of money, and one of the main ways they did this was by selling war bonds to their own citizens. This wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a way to make everyone feel like they were part of the war effort. And music was a key tool for selling these bonds. The American government's Treasury Department organized massive bond drives. These were often star-studded events. Hollywood actors, radio personalities, and most importantly, musicians would tour the country, holding rallies to encourage people to buy bonds. These events were part concert, part patriotic rally. Irving Berlin, one of America's most famous songwriters, wrote a whole musical revue in 1942 called This Is the Army. The show toured the US and even played for troops in Europe. It featured songs like I Left My Heart at the Stage Door Canteen. All the profits from the show, which amounted to nearly $10 million, a staggering sum at the time, were donated to the Army Emergency Relief Fund. And the show's primary purpose was to sell war bonds at every performance. Songs were written specifically for this purpose. The 1942 tune, Annie Bonds Today, became the official theme song of the U.S. Treasury's National Defense Savings Program. It was a short, peppy jingle performed by the Andrews Sisters. It played constantly on the radio and before movies. The lyrics were simple and direct. The tall man with the hi-hat and the whiskers on his chin will soon be knocking at your door, and you ought to be in. Get your savings out when you hear him shout, any bonds today. It turned the act of buying a bond into a simple, neighborly, and patriotic duty. The Kate Smith Hour, a popular radio show, was another powerful tool. On September 21st, 1943, singer Kate Smith hosted an 18-hour marathon broadcast to sell war bonds. She spoke and sang, making emotional appeals to her listeners. By the end of the marathon, she had sold over $107 million worth of bonds. This incredible feat was studied by sociologist Robert K. Merton in his book Mass Persuasion. He analyzed why her appeal was so effective. He concluded it was her image of sincerity, patriotism, and trustworthiness. When she sang God Bless America, people believed her, and they opened their wallets. Music made the abstract concept of financing a war feel personal and emotional. It transformed a government financial program into a mass cultural movement. But was this use of music a form of emotional manipulation, using powerful songs to pressure citizens into giving up their savings? How many people bought bonds they couldn't afford because they were swept up in the patriotic fervor of a musical rally? And did the constant cheerful jingles about buying bonds trivialize the very real and brutal reasons why that money was needed? Number 12. Can you dance away your fears? In the midst of air raids, rationing, and constant anxiety, people needed an escape. They found it in the dance halls. The swing and big band music that dominated the era wasn't just entertainment, it was a form of mass therapy. For a few hours, people could lose themselves in the rhythm and forget about the war. The dominant dance was the jitterbug or the Lindy Hop. It was fast, athletic, and improvisational. It required energy and focus. You couldn't be thinking about a loved one overseas or the next air raid siren when you were trying to execute a complicated spin. It was a full-body distraction. Dance halls like the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem or the Hammersmith Palais in London were packed every night. They were spaces of noise, movement, and life, a stark contrast to the blackout, darkened streets outside. The bands that provided the soundtrack were led by superstars like Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and Glenn Miller. Their music was characterized by a powerful rhythm section and soaring brass. It was music that demanded a physical response. In her book, Dancing in the Blitz, How World War II Made British Popular Culture, historian Letty Ratner argues that dancing was a way for people to reclaim a sense of control. They couldn't control the bombers overhead, but they could control their own bodies on the dance floor. It was an act of defiance, a way of saying that life and joy would continue. This was true even on the front lines. The U.S. United Service Organizations famously organized camp shows for troops. These often included bands that would play for dances. Even in a makeshift hall on a base in the South Pacific, a dance could provide a desperately needed sense of normalcy. It was a reminder of what they were fighting for, a world where such simple joys were possible. The presence of female dance partners, often Red Cross volunteers or local women, was also a huge morale booster, a brief connection to a world outside the all-male military environment. The music itself was often optimistic and forward-looking. Songs like In the Mood by Glenn Miller or Sing, Sing, Sing by Benny Goodman are explosions of pure energy. They don't have complex or sad lyrics. They are about the feeling of the music itself. This was the perfect antidote to the gloom and uncertainty of the times. It was an injection of pure, uncomplicated joy. But how much of this frantic dancing was a healthy release, and how much was a desperate, almost hysterical attempt to ignore a traumatic reality? Did the loud, cheerful music in the dance halls create a false sense of security, making the eventual return to the quiet, dangerous streets even more jarring? And for those who had lost loved ones, did the sight and sound of this forced public merriment sometimes feel isolating or even insulting? Number 11. How did Hollywood turn war into a musical? The movies were a huge part of life in the 1940s. They were a primary source of news, propaganda, and, most importantly, escapism. And during the war, the Hollywood musical became one of the most popular genres. These films presented a vision of the war that was clean, cheerful, and filled with song and dance. In films like Star-Spangled Rhythm, 1942, and This Is the Army, 1943, were essentially all-star revues. They featured dozens of famous actors and musicians, all doing their part for the war effort. The plots were thin, often revolving around putting on a show for the troops. The real point was the spectacle and the patriotism. Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, and Dorothy Lamour starred in the famous Road 2. They transported audiences to exotic, funny locations far from the grim headlines. These musicals served several purposes. First, they were pure morale boosters. They were optimistic and funny. They assured audiences that the cause was just and that victory was inevitable. The songs were catchy and upbeat. Audiences left the theater humming the tunes and feeling a little bit better about the world. According to the book The Hollywood Musical by Clive Hirschhorn, box office receipts soared during the war years as people flocked to cinemas for a dose of escapism. Second, they were a powerful form of propaganda. They presented an idealized version of American or British life. The soldiers were always brave and wisecracking. The women on the home front were always resilient and cheerful. The sense of national unity was always perfect. The films rarely showed the dirt, the fear, or the death of actual combat. For example, in the film For Me and My Gal 1942, Judy Garland and Gene Kelly play vaudeville performers during the First World War, but its patriotic message was aimed squarely at a wee audience. It made sacrifice and service seem glamorous. Third, they reinforced the connection between the home front and the front lines. The plots often centered on soldiers on leave or entertainers going overseas. This constantly reminded the audience of the troops and framed the support of them as a central, positive part of life. But what was the psychological effect of consuming such a sanitized and unrealistic portrayal of the conflict? Did these cheerful musicals create a dangerous gap between the public's perception of the war and the brutal reality faced by the soldiers? And how many soldiers, raised on these films, felt a sense of disillusionment or betrayal when they encountered the true musical nature of combat? Number 10 was a homesick song, a form of medicine. Nostalgia was one of the most powerful emotions during the war. Soldiers longed for home. Families longed for their loved ones to return. Music became the primary vehicle for this emotion. Songs about home, about specific places, and about the dream of returning to a peaceful life were incredibly popular. They were a form of emotional medicine. The undisputed king of this genre was Bing Crosby. His 1943 recording of I'll Be Home for Christmas captured the feeling perfectly. The song is sung from the perspective of a soldier overseas. He asks his family to prepare for his arrival, but the final line, "If only in my dreams," delivers a heartbreaking twist. It acknowledges the reality that many would not make it home. This mix of hope and melancholy was incredibly potent. It validated the feelings of both the soldiers and their families. It was one of the most requested songs on the Armed Forces radio service. Another huge hit was A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square. It became popular in Britain after Vera Lynn recorded it. The song is a beautiful, nostalgic remembrance of a romantic evening in London. For people huddling in bomb shelters in that same city, the song was a reminder of a more peaceful, romantic time. It was an escape into a memory. It allowed them to mentally transport themselves away from the danger, even for just a few minutes. Research in psychology, like studies by Dr. Konstantin Sedekides at the University of Southampton, has shown that nostalgia can counteract loneliness and anxiety. These songs were providing that benefit on a mass scale. The music connected people across vast distances. A soldier listening to I'll Be Home for Christmas on a radio in Italy knew that his family might be listening to the same song back in Ohio. They were sharing the same emotional experience, even though they were thousands of miles apart. This created a powerful sense of connection and shared hope. The songs became a proxy for the letters that were often slow to arrive. They said what everyone was feeling: I miss you and I want to come home. These weren't patriotic anthems demanding sacrifice. They were quiet, personal songs that spoke to the heart. They acknowledged the pain of separation and offered the comfort of a shared dream. But was there a point where nostalgia became counterproductive? Could focusing too much on the past and the dream of home make it harder for a soldier to cope with the present reality of their deployment? Did these sad, sweet songs sometimes increase feelings of depression and homesickness rather than easing them? And how did soldiers from less happy homes, for whom home was not an idyllic place, react to this constant stream of sentimental music? Number 9. How did music make factories hum? The home front was another battlefield. The production of planes, tanks, ships, and munitions was crucial to the war effort. Factories operated 24 hours a day. The work was often repetitive, exhausting, and dangerous. To keep workers focused and productive, both the British and American governments turned to music. In Britain, the BBC launched a program in 1940 called Music While You Work. It was broadcast twice a day, directly into factories. The music was carefully selected. A 1943 study by the Industrial Health Research Board found that the right kind of music could increase factory output by as much as 15%. The researchers discovered that upbeat, familiar tunes were best. They avoided music that was too distracting, too slow, or too sentimental. The tempo was key. The rhythm of the music was meant to match the rhythm of the machines and the workers' movements. It wasn't about entertainment, it was about industrial efficiency. The United States followed a similar model. The War Production Board actively encouraged the installation of public address systems in factories to play music. At companies like Muzak, which had previously provided background music for hotels and restaurants, found a huge new market in industrial plants. They curated playlists based on scientific principles, believing that an ascending program of music which gradually got more upbeat could combat fatigue at key points in a shift. A 1943 article in Time magazine reported on the widespread adoption of this practice, calling music a production tool. The songs played were the popular hits of the day: big band, swing, and peppy vocal numbers. This served a dual purpose. It provided the stimulating rhythm needed for the work, but it also kept the workers connected to the wider culture. They were hearing the same songs their sons or husbands were hearing on the armed forces radio. It reinforced the idea that their work on the assembly line was directly connected to the fighting overseas. They were all part of the same effort, listening to the same soundtrack. This use of music was a new and deliberate application of psychological principles to the workplace. It treated morale and mood not as abstract concepts, but as measurable factors of production, just like electricity or raw materials. But was this practice a benevolent attempt to improve working conditions, or was it a form of corporate and government control, using music to squeeze more productivity out of an already exhausted workforce? How did the workers themselves feel about the non-stop, scientifically selected music? Did they ever just want silence? And what happens to human creativity and spirit when even the music you listen to is engineered for maximum efficiency? Number 8. Why did the enemy need to be a joke? Humor is a powerful weapon. It can be used to belittle a fearsome enemy, making them seem less threatening. During the war, a whole genre of novelty songs emerged that used satire and comedy to mock the leaders of the Axis powers. These songs were hugely popular and served an important psychological purpose. One of the most famous examples was Spike Jones and his City Slickers' 1942 recording of Der Fuhrer's Face. The song is a raspberry-filled cacophony of sound effects and silly lyrics. It portrays the enemy leader as a buffoon. The chorus, which ends with a loud raspberry, was a way for people to collectively and safely express their contempt. The song was so popular that it was used as the title for a Disney animated short film starring Donald Duck. By turning the enemy into a joke, the song robbed him of his power to intimidate. It reduced a figure of fear into an object of ridicule. Another popular novelty song was "We're Gonna Have to Slap the Dirty Little Jap." While the title and lyrics are deeply offensive by modern standards, reflecting the racist attitudes of the time, its function was similar. It aimed to dehumanize and belittle the enemy, making them seem contemptible and easily beatable. These songs were a form of catharsis, a way to channel anger and fear into laughter. In Britain, artists like Arthur Askey and Tommy Trinder performed comedic songs that mocked the enemy's pronouncements and military failures. These were often performed in music halls and on the radio. This kind of humor was a long-standing British tradition, and it was adapted for the war effort. According to the book Lauder in the Dark, a study of the satirical film comedy of the Second World War by Mark Glancy, this type of satire helped to maintain a sense of British pluck and resilience. It suggested that if you could still laugh at the enemy, you hadn't been beaten. These songs were not subtle. They were broad, loud, and often silly, but they were effective. They provided a simple, shareable way for people to feel superior to a powerful foe. They fostered a sense of us versus them and boosted confidence. It was a form of psychological warfare waged on the home front, using trombones and sound effects as ammunition. But what is the long-term cost of using music to dehumanize an entire nation or a group of people? How much did these songs contribute to the racist attitudes that led to policies like the internment of Japanese Americans? And is there a difference between laughing at a specific leader and laughing at an entire population? and did these songs cross that line? Number 7. Who sang for the Forgotten Allies? While the focus is often on American and British music, the war was a global alliance. Music played a role in celebrating and acknowledging the contributions of other Allied nations, particularly the Soviet Union, which was a crucial partner for much of the conflict. In 1942, as the Battle of Stalingrad raged, there was a surge of pro-Russian sentiment in the United States and Britain. This was reflected in the music. Hollywood produced films like Mission to Moscow and The North Star, which portrayed the Soviets in a heroic light. These films often had musical scores that incorporated Russian folk melodies. There was even a brief fad for Russian-themed popular songs. The sheet music for a song called Stalingrad was published in 1943. While not a major hit, its existence shows a desire to connect with and honor this distant ally. More significant was the performance of classical music. The Russian composer Dmitri Shostakovich wrote his Symphony No. 7, the Leningrad, during the siege of that city. The score was microfilmed and smuggled out of the country. It received its American premiere on July 19, 1942, performed by the NBC Symphony Orchestra under the baton of Arturo Toscanini. The performance was broadcast to an audience of millions. It was a huge cultural event. The music critic Virgil Thompson wrote about the symphony's immense propaganda value. For the American public, listening to this powerful, dramatic music was a way to experience the suffering and resilience of the Russian people. It made the alliance feel real and profound. Similarly, songs from other Allied nations were sometimes adopted and translated. The song of the French resistance, Le Chant des Partisans, the Song of the Partisans, became known internationally as a hymn of freedom fighters. Its somber but determined melody conveyed the spirit of underground resistance everywhere. This musical outreach was a form of public diplomacy. It helped to build popular support for the alliances, which were sometimes politically complex. A shared piece of music could create a feeling of solidarity that political speeches could not. It humanized allies who might otherwise seem foreign and remote. It reminded people that they were not fighting alone. But how genuine was this musical celebration of allies like the Soviet Union, and how quickly did it disappear once the political winds shifted after the war? Did the American or British public truly understand the cultural context of a piece like Shostakovich's symphony, or did they simply consume it as a generic symbol of heroic struggle? And how did the soldiers and civilians of these other Allied nations feel about their culture being filtered through the lens of Hollywood and American pop music? And number 6, could a song remind you why you fight? Beyond the simple patriotism of saluting the flag, music also helped to articulate the deeper values that the Allies claimed to be fighting for. Songs about freedom, democracy, and a better future were an essential part of the morale-boosting effort. They were the why behind the fighting. Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man, which premiered in 1943, is a powerful example. The piece is not a traditional jingoistic military march. It is slow, majestic, and deeply resonant. By dedicating it to the common man, Copland was making a profound statement. He was suggesting that the war was being fought not for kings or presidents, but for ordinary people. Its title was a direct rebuttal to the elitist ideologies of the opposing regimes. The music itself, with its open, spacious sound, became synonymous with a certain vision of American democratic ideals. In the world of popular music, the song "This Is My Country" became a standard. Written in 1940, it gained immense popularity during the war. Its lyrics speak of a deep, personal love for the land and its ideals of freedom. It wasn't about aggression or conquest. It was a song of devotion and defense. Similarly, Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land," written in 1940 but not widely known until later, offered a populist, grassroots vision of patriotism. Perhaps the most ambitious attempt to set these ideals to music was the Ballad for Americans. It was a 12-minute cantata written in 1939 with lyrics by John Traville Latouche and music by Earl Robinson. It was famously performed on the radio by Paul Robeson. The piece is a sweeping history of America, celebrating its diversity and its ongoing struggle for freedom. It explicitly mentions workers, farmers, and people of all races and religions. It was a powerful and inclusive vision of what America could be. As historian Michael Denning discusses in his book, The Cultural Front, works like Ballad for Americans were part of a broader popular front culture that sought to define American identity in progressive, democratic terms in direct opposition to totalitarianism. These pieces of music were more than just entertainment. They were public arguments for a certain set of values. They helped to frame the war not just as a conflict between nations, but as a struggle between competing ideas about how societies should be organized and what it means to be human. But did the lofty inclusive ideals expressed in songs like Ballad for Americans match the reality of a segregated and often discriminatory society at home? How did minority soldiers, who were fighting for freedoms they themselves were denied, react to this music? And was this music of ideas truly effective at motivating the average person, or were they more moved by the simpler songs about home and romance? Number 5, how did a live show compete with a battle? Records and radio were vital, but there was something uniquely powerful about a live performance. The USO and its British equivalent, the ENSA Entertainment's National Service Association, organized thousands of shows for troops, often very close to the front lines. These shows brought a piece of home right to the soldier's doorstep. The scale of the USO operation was staggering. By 1945, they were putting on over 700 shows a day. Stars like Bob Hope, Jack Benny, and Francis Langford traveled relentlessly through every theater of war. Hope's comedy routines were legendary. He had a knack for tailoring his jokes to the specific unit he was performing for, showing the soldiers that he understood their daily lives. According to the biography Bob Hope, A Life in Comedy by William Robert Faith, Hope spent nearly every Christmas during the war overseas with the troops. But it wasn't just the big stars. Thousands of lesser-known performers, from dancers and singers to magicians and comedians, joined USO troops. They performed on makeshift stages, on the backs of trucks, and in hospital wards. The singer and actress Marlene Dietrich was famous for her dedication to performing for the troops. Born in Germany, her opposition to the regime there was deeply personal. She toured extensively, often in dangerous conditions, singing songs like Lily Marlene and bringing a touch of glamour and defiant spirit to the front. These live shows were a powerful antidote to the dehumanizing effects of combat. They were a reminder of a world of laughter, beauty, and art. Seeing a familiar face from the movies, or hearing a favorite singer in person, was an incredible morale boost. It made the soldiers feel seen and appreciated. It was a clear message from the home front: we have not forgotten you. The shows also provided a crucial emotional release. They allowed soldiers to laugh, to cheer, and sometimes, during a sentimental ballad, to cry. They broke the monotony and tension of military life. For an hour or two, the soldiers were not just numbers in a unit, they were an audience, individuals sharing a moment of joy and entertainment. But what was the experience like for the performers themselves, especially the women, traveling through war zones? How much danger were they truly in? We hear the stories of the successful shows, but how many were canceled due to attacks? And what was the psychological toll on the entertainers? And did the brief, bright burst of a USO show sometimes make the return to the grim reality of war even more difficult for the soldiers? Number 4, could music heal a wounded body and mind? The war produced casualties on an unprecedented scale, both physical and psychological. And in hospitals on the home front and near the battlefields, music began to be used in a more deliberate therapeutic way. This was the beginning of modern music therapy. The American Red Cross actively recruited musicians to play in military hospitals as part of their recreational services. These were not formal concerts. Musicians would go from ward to ward, playing for small groups of wounded soldiers. They found that the right kind of music could have a remarkable effect. For men suffering from what was then called shell shock or combat fatigue, now known as PSD, music could be a calming influence. Familiar songs from home could help to orient them and provide a sense of safety. The medical community began to take this seriously. The U.S. War Department issued a technical bulletin in 1945 titled Music in Reconditioning in ASF Convalescent and General Hospitals. This document outlined how music could be used to achieve specific therapeutic goals. It suggested that listening to music could reduce anxiety before surgery, and that active participation, like singing or playing an instrument, could help with physical rehabilitation. For example, playing a piano could help a soldier regain strength and dexterity in a wounded hand. The book Music and Medicine from 1948 contains essays from doctors and musicians who worked during this period documenting these early efforts. They observed that music could distract patients from their pain and boredom. Group singing was used to build a sense of community among the wounded, counteracting the isolation that often comes with injury. This was a shift in thinking. Music was no longer just entertainment or a general morale booster, it was being seen as a specific tool that could be applied to treat specific conditions. The experiences of the war led directly to the establishment of the first music therapy degree programs in the late 1940s. The thousands of musicians who volunteered in hospitals saw firsthand the power of music to soothe, to heal, and to reconnect a broken mind to the world. But how systematic were these early efforts, and how much of the benefit was simply due to the novelty of having a visitor rather than the music itself? What kind of music was found to be ineffective or even harmful for patients with certain psychological injuries? And why did it take so long for these wartime observations to be fully accepted and integrated into mainstream medical practice? Number 3, how do you write a national prayer? In times of great crisis, people often turn to faith. During the war, certain songs took on the quality of a national prayer. They were not explicitly religious hymns, but they expressed a collective hope, a plea for divine favor, and a sense of shared destiny. Irving Berlin's God Bless America is the ultimate example. It was written in 1918, but was revised and introduced to the public by singer Kate Smith in 1938 as war was looming in Europe. The song quickly became a kind of unofficial national anthem. Its message is simple and direct a plea for God to bless and protect the nation. It was sung at war bond rallies, in schools, and at public gatherings. Its popularity was immense. Berlin, a Russian-born immigrant, assigned all royalties from the song to the Boy and Girl Scouts of America. The song's power came from its combination of patriotism and piety. It framed the nation's cause as a righteous one, deserving of divine protection. In Britain, the song We'll Meet Again, made famous by Vera Lynn, served a similar function. While the lyrics are about personal separation, the song's context gave it a much broader, almost spiritual meaning. The promise to meet again some sunny day became a national article of faith. It was a statement of belief in a future beyond the conflict. Singing, it was an act of collective hope. Vera Lynn herself, in her autobiography Some Sunny Day, speaks of how the song became bigger than her, belonging to everyone who is separated from a loved one. These songs were powerful because they were inclusive. They did not belong to one specific religion. They spoke in broad terms of faith, hope, and divine guidance. This allowed people from different backgrounds to share in the sentiment. They were simple enough for everyone to sing. When a crowd of thousands sang God Bless America together, it was a powerful, unifying experience. It was a way of collectively asking for strength and deliverance. These songs were not orders from the government. They were organic expressions of a national mood. They filled a deep psychological need for reassurance and for a sense of a higher purpose in the midst of chaos and suffering. But did these songs create a dangerous fusion of nationalism and religion, suggesting that God was exclusively on one side of the conflict? How did people who were not religious or who belonged to minority faiths feel when these quasi-hymns became the dominant public expression of hope? And could the comforting, prayer-like quality of these songs have encouraged a kind of passivity, a sense of, leaving it to God, rather than focusing on the hard, practical work that needed to be done? Number 2, was it all just propaganda? It's impossible to talk about the music of the war without talking about propaganda. Governments on all sides understood that popular music was a powerful tool for shaping public opinion. The line between morale boosting and pure propaganda was often very thin, and sometimes it disappeared altogether. The U.S. government's Office of War Information, OWI, established in 1942, worked directly with the music industry. The OWI's Music Committee published a music war guide for songwriters and publishers. This guide outlined what kind of songs were considered helpful to the war effort. It encouraged songs about the ideals of freedom, songs that celebrated the Allies, and songs that encouraged work on the home front. It also discouraged songs that might be seen as divisive or demoralizing. For example, it warned against overly sentimental mummy songs, fearing they would make soldiers too homesick. It also tried to discourage songs that were seen as counterproductive. Many songwriters willingly participated. At Tin Pan Alley, the center of the American music publishing industry, churned out patriotic songs. Titles like We Did It Before and We Can Do It Again and He's One A in the Army and He's a One in My Heart were common. These songs were often formulaic and simple, designed to deliver a clear, positive message. As documented in Kathleen E.R. Smith's book, God Bless America, Tin Pan Alley Goes to War, the industry saw patriotism as both a duty and a good business opportunity. On the radio, propaganda was more subtle. The optimistic tone of the big bands, the cheerful chatter of the DJs, and the constant stream of patriotic songs all contributed to a specific, government-approved vision of the war. The enemy, in contrast, was often portrayed in music as either monstrous or ridiculous. This wasn't just an American phenomenon. Every government involved in the conflict used music to promote its message. The BBC in Britain carefully curated its playlists to maintain a mood of steadfast resilience. The regimes in Germany and Italy promoted music that glorified militarism and national purity, while banning sounds like jazz that were seen as corrupting. So, while we remember the music of the era for its power to comfort and inspire, it's crucial to remember that much of it was part of a deliberate, calculated effort to manage the thoughts and feelings of the population. But how much of the music's impact was due to the government's guiding hand, and how much was simply a reflection of genuine public sentiment? Is a song still a work of art if it is created according to a government guide? And what is the real difference between a song that boosts morale and a song that is propaganda? Is it just a matter of whose side you are on? Number 1. What does a free sound like? Ultimately, the most powerful role music played for the Allies was as a symbol of the very freedom they were fighting for. The popular music of the United States and Britain was vibrant, diverse, and dynamic. It was a product of a free and open culture, and it sounded like it. Think of the sound of a big band in full swing, the improvisation of a jazz solo, the call and response between different sections of the orchestra, the sheer energy and joy of the music. This was the sound of freedom of expression. Artists like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Benny Goodman were creating a uniquely American art form. And jazz and swing were products of a multicultural society. They blended African American and European musical traditions. This diversity stood in stark contrast to the rigid, state-controlled, and culturally puritanical music promoted by the totalitarian regimes. The fact that soldiers could tune their radios to the AFARs and hear a wild trumpet solo from Harry James or the smooth crooning of Frank Sinatra was significant. It was a sonic reminder of the world they were fighting to protect. A world with dance halls, with creative expression, with individual artists becoming superstars based on their talent. The music itself was the message. This was understood at the highest levels. In 1942, the head of the Office of War Information, Elmer Davis, said, "The easiest way to sell a product is to have a good product." In this context, American popular music was a good product. It was proof of the vitality and appeal of a democratic culture. When the Office broadcast jazz and swing across Europe, it wasn't just entertainment. It was cultural warfare. It was beaming a message of a more dynamic, more joyful, and freer way of life directly into occupied territories. The very act of listening to this music could be an act of rebellion for people living under oppressive regimes. It was a taste of a forbidden world. The music represented everything their own governments feared: individualism, spontaneity, and cultural mixing. The soundtrack of the Allies wasn't just a collection of songs. It was the audible evidence of the ideals they were fighting for. But was this sound of freedom a true reflection of American society, or was it an idealized export that masked deep internal problems like racial segregation? How did the African American artists who created jazz and swing feel about their music being used as a symbol of a freedom they themselves did not fully possess? And in the end, is it possible that the most enduring legacy of the war's music was not the patriotic anthems, but the infectious, democratic, and revolutionary rhythm of swing that conquered the world more completely than any army?